Medieval sex was anything but romantic. Between superstition, fear, and punishment, desire became something dangerous, something to control, punish, or even mutilate. From iron chastity belts to bizarre medical rituals, the Middle Ages turned intimacy into obsession. Every act of pleasure was weighed against sin, and people went to disturbing extremes to tame it. Medieval sex was anything but romantic. Between superstition, fear, and punishment, desire became something dangerous, something to control, punish, or even mutilate. From iron chastity belts to bizarre medical rituals, the Middle Ages turned intimacy into obsession. Every act of pleasure was weighed against sin, and people went to disturbing extremes to tame it. If you enjoy this kind of dark history, please like the video and subscribe. Now, let's step into a world where passion was chained in metal and medicine was pure madness. It's one of the most infamous symbols of the Middle Ages, the chastity belt, a cruel invention said to keep women pure while their husbands were away. Iron, leather, sometimes lined with spikes, a cage built for control, not protection. Historians still debate whether these belts were truly used or exaggerated later, but the mindset behind them was very real. Medieval men lived in constant fear of betrayal. For many, a wife's body wasn't hers. It was property to be guarded. Before leaving for crusades or long journeys, some men sealed their wives' clothing with wax, then had servants verify that the seal remained untouched. Others forced women to swear oaths of chastity before the entire village. The shame wasn't private. It was public theater, designed to prove obedience. The belt itself, when it existed, was often nothing more than rough metal strapped around the hips and locked shut. There was no concern for comfort or hygiene. Infections, sores, and pain were simply part of the price for virtue. And when the husband returned, he held the only key, a literal symbol of power over the body. But the chastity belt was only part of a wider obsession. In towns and courts, female desire was treated as a threat, something that needed to be suppressed, humiliated, or controlled. Women accused of infidelity could be forced to wear iron masks shaped like donkeys or pigs. Some masks even had gags attached, preventing them from speaking. These punishments were never just about sex. They were about hierarchy. In a world ruled by men, a woman's body became a canvas on which control, fear, and ownership were engraved. Ironically, while women were shamed for lust, men's infidelity was often excused as nature. Brothels thrived. Priests broke their vows. Yet the same society obsessed over locking women away from temptation. It wasn't morality, it was hypocrisy turned ritual. The chastity belt may have been a myth of metal, but the belief it represented was painfully real. In the medieval mind, desire wasn't a shared pleasure. It was a dangerous weapon, and women were blamed for wielding it. If the church tried to control the soul, medieval medicine tried to control the flesh, and it often made things worse. Doctors believed desire wasn't moral or emotional, it was chemical. The human body, they said, was ruled by 4 humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Too much heat or moisture could ignite lust. Too little could cause melancholy, infertility, or even madness. Sex was seen as both a cure and a disease. Men were told to avoid excess or they'd lose their vital spirit. Women were told to have just enough, or their wombs would wander through the body and suffocate them. A horrifying belief that gave birth to one of the strangest diagnoses in history: hysteria. Doctors described it as a physical illness caused by a starving womb. The solution? Release the built-up desire. Some physicians recommended herbs or baths. Others prescribed manual stimulation to bring balance back to the body. It was unknowingly a medicalized form of sexuality, centuries before anyone dared to talk about it openly. But that was just the beginning. Medieval Europe was obsessed with finding remedies for lust, impotence, and infertility, and the results were as bizarre as they were dangerous. A man who struggled to perform was told to drink potions made from roasted wolf penis, goat blood, or the ashes of sparrow hearts. For women, fertility charms included amulets made from rabbit bones or even dried animal testicles tied around the neck. Every ingredient had a meaning: strength, virility, or submission. People didn't just believe these worked. They believed refusing them was sinful, a rejection of God's natural order. Then there were the love potions, sold secretly by healers, monks, and even prostitutes. They mixed wine with strange ingredients: powdered toad, menstrual blood, or crushed herbs known for their hallucinogenic effects. One sip could make a person dizzy, euphoric, or violently ill. It wasn't real magic, but it could create the illusion of love, or the excuse for it. And among the most disturbing myths was one whispered across Europe: that sleeping with a virgin could cure leprosy or disease. Desperate men, sometimes even nobles, believed it. It led to assaults, to silence, to tragedy. Medicine, faith, and fear blended into one. Every potion, every cure, every ritual said the same thing: sex was dangerous, but abstinence was worse. When medicine failed, people turned to magic. And in the Middle Ages, magic often meant sex: twisted, forbidden, and terrifying. The church believed demons used lust as a weapon. Men claimed they were visited in the night by succubi, female demons who drained them through pleasure. Women, meanwhile, confessed to being mounted by incubi, dark spirits said to steal their purity. Of course, most of these encounters were the result of dreams, sleep paralysis, or trauma. But the church took them literally. Thousands of people came to believe their bodies were instruments of the devil. This fear gave birth to witch hunts that blended desire with damnation. Women were accused not only of casting curses, but of using sex to control men as souls. Inquisitors described horrific rituals in which witches anointed themselves with ointments made from baby fat, animal blood, and hallucinogenic herbs, then flew through the night to Sabbaths where demons presided over grotesque orgies. In truth, these were mostly fantasies of frightened men, priests projecting their own forbidden desires onto women. But behind the hysteria, some real practices did exist. Herbalists and midwives used mixtures of belladonna, mandrake, and henbane, plants that induced trance-like states and erotic hallucinations. During these ceremonies, participants believed they were joining with spirits, blurring the line between ecstasy and worship. It was less about evil than about escape, a way for people, especially women, to reclaim control over their bodies in a world that had taken it away. Still, the fear of sexual magic didn't stop there. Men who suddenly found themselves impotent often claimed they'd been hexed by a witch. In some trials, they testified that their genitals had disappeared or been tied in knots. Priests performed exorcisms over the afflicted parts, sprinkling holy water and reciting prayers to release the devil's grip. Sometimes the accused women were tortured until they confessed, confessing to impossible crimes because silence meant death. In the medieval imagination, desire itself became a portal to the supernatural. Pleasure wasn't just risky, it was demonic. To want was to sin. To touch was to invite the devil. Magic didn't corrupt the Middle Ages, fear did. And nowhere did fear burn brighter than in the bedroom. In medieval Europe, pleasure could easily turn into punishment. Every act of passion was one misstep away from crime, and the consequences were brutal. Adultery wasn't just a personal betrayal, it was a violation of order. In some towns, men caught in the act were castrated, women were shaved bald, and both were paraded naked through the streets. In Florence, offenders were forced to walk through the city holding candles, confessing their sin aloud as the crowd jeered. In Germany, couples caught together could be chained face to face and forced to march until exhaustion or death. These punishments weren't designed to correct behavior, they were public theater. Every humiliation was meant to remind others, pleasure belongs to God's rules, not yours. And yet, the system was soaked in hypocrisy. Rich nobles often escaped justice with fines or favors, while peasants bore the full spectacle of shame. It wasn't morality, it was domination disguised as virtue. Some punishments took on grotesque forms. Women accused of promiscuity could be fitted with iron masks shaped like animals, donkeys, pigs, or birds, with spikes pressed against the tongue to prevent speech. Others were forced to wear scold's bridles, metal cages locked around the head with a bar that entered the mouth. These weren't only for gossipers. They were for women who spoke, resisted, or simply refused to be silent about desire. In France and England, prostitutes could be flogged, branded, or forced to wear distinctive clothing, often yellow, marking them as public women. They were banned from markets, churches, and homes. Society used them, then discarded them in plain sight. The church also had its own form of punishment: public penance. Couples accused of sinful acts were made to kneel at the church door in plain view, sometimes naked to the waist, begging for forgiveness as townsfolk passed by. The goal wasn't to cleanse the soul, it was to humiliate the flesh. Even so, secret punishments sometimes turned darker: whipping, starvation, forced vows of chastity, all forms of control that blurred the line between repentance and cruelty. The medieval world had no tolerance for private pleasure. It demanded public pain. Every sin of the body was punished through the body, because to suffer was to prove obedience. For all its laws, its punishments, and its sermons, the medieval world could never truly suppress desire. It only drove it underground. Every major city, Paris, London, Florence, Prague, had its official brothels. They weren't hidden dens of sin, they were registered businesses, often located just a few streets away from churches. Authorities justified them as a necessary evil. Better, they said, for men to visit prostitutes than to corrupt honest women. Inside, the atmosphere was far from glamorous. Women were inspected by officials, taxed by the city, and forbidden from wearing fine clothes. They were allowed to exist only as long as they served a purpose. Outside those walls, they were despised. Inside, they were essential. It was hypocrisy at its purest. Some brothels were even owned or supervised by local governments, a way to keep lust contained. In certain cities, the church collected rent from these establishments, quietly benefiting from the very sin it condemned. Priests visited in secret. Nobles went openly. The same men who preached chastity by day sought it out by night. But desire wasn't limited to the streets. Behind closed doors, the medieval elite indulged in private pleasures of their own. Banquets often ended with games of love, where servants, jesters, and courtesans were forced to perform for their masters. What was forbidden for commoners was entertainment for the powerful. There were also the festes des fous, the feasts of fools, when order briefly turned upside down. Clergy and peasants alike mocked authority, drank, and broke every moral rule. For one night, sin became freedom. It was chaos, laughter, and lust, proof that repression always creates explosion. In private, people found ways to defy the system. Coded gestures, secret lovers, poems exchanged under confessionals. The more society tried to bury desire, the deeper it rooted itself in the human heart. By the end of the Middle Ages, entire neighborhoods were built around the trade of sex, tolerated, taxed, and indispensable. The same civilization that claimed to fear lust had, without realizing it, built its economy on it. The church could dictate the rules, the law could punish the sinners. But behind every door and curtain, one truth remained: desire never dies, it just hides where no one dares to look. The Middle Ages tried everything to silence desire. They forged iron belts, mixed blood and herbs into potions, punished pleasure in public squares, and turned lust into witchcraft. But none of it worked. Every sermon against sin only made it more fascinating. Every punishment only drove it deeper underground. Desire was not destroyed. It adapted. The church could dictate when and how people were allowed to touch, but it could never stop them from wanting. Even in monasteries, behind the thickest walls, temptation lived on. It whispered through the confessional, through poetry, through glances across candlelight. The Middle Ages are often remembered for their wars, plagues, and cathedrals, but they were also a time when humanity's oldest instinct was chained and tortured in the name of virtue. And yet, in every story, in every punishment, the same truth endures. You can bind the body, but never the desire that moves it.